for this piece of legislation, because it wasn't health experts, it wasn't the legal profession, it definitely wasn't former prime ministers and heads, those who have led former political parties, it wasn't regular New Zealanders. In fact, regular New Zealanders decided to overwhelmingly oppose this piece of legislation. So if we just boil it down to the two main threads of argument that were heard at Select Committee and have been well canvassed in the media landscape over the last few months as this minister has decided to push this legislation through despite the overwhelming opposition. On the one side, we've heard that it's largely redundant, that it is going to be duplicative, and as indeed Dr. Duncan Webb alluded to, it'll be expensive. Then on the other side of the debate, at the most egregious end, we hear very clearly that what this legislation does is provide a framework for multinational corporations to be compensated by the people of this country when this parliament decides to curtail their supposed right to destroy our shared environment, our climate, or to incur on our human rights. So, Mr. Speaker, I think again, one of those foundational questions. We hear a heck of a lot from the Libertarian or the supposed Libertarian Party in this place about special treatment for certain demographics in our country. And we have to ask ourselves, who really is getting special treatment in this country? Yep. Because so frequently we hear the minister in charge of this legislation say that it is precisely the same communities and demographics who are disproportionately overrepresented in every single negative statistic in our society. We then don't hear next to anything about the corporations who are exploiting both people and planet, and in fact, they seek to pass this legislation which makes it easier for them to do precisely that exploitation. I find it quite fascinating, Mr. Speaker, that we are indeed having this debate about a law, about how a law is made. This law being the constraints of the rules of how we are supposed to progress with making legislation into the future. And we have a situation where the minister couldn't follow his own rules. Yep. He wants to talk about good lawmaking, yet he couldn't even uphold the processes of good lawmaking. Today, the Minister of Education is removing Te Tiriti obligations from schools and saying that it is the Crown's obligation to uphold those obligations. Yet we have represented in this very piece of legislation the removal and the deprioritisation of Te Tiriti as a principle that is to be considered in good lawmaking practices. Which leads us to the statement from the Waitangi Tribunal, and here I quote from their urgent inquiry report nonetheless, that the Crown accepted that its policy development for the bill occurred without targeted engagement for Māori. The Tribunal found that this was in violation of the Crown's obligation to consult with Māori in good faith and therefore violated treaty principles of partnership and active protection. Further, Mr. Speaker, we hear from the likes of the Legislation Design and Advisory Committee, who submitted on the first round of the design of this legislation, which I might add had approximately 25,000 submissions, which again were overwhelmingly opposed to this legislation. And they said at that point in time that they had, quote, misgivings about the capacity of this bill to offer improvements because they see risks with the proposals, including the risk of significant unintended consequences. They then went into three key prongs. The bill is unnecessary to the extent that it restates existing constraints and the principles of good lawmaking. Secondly, the principles contained in the bill are selective and deeply contestable. And thirdly, the bill has the potential for significant constitutional impact that has not been fully explored. Mr. Speaker, if we are to take the minister's arguments in good faith, at just that surface level, and to ignore all of the behaviour and everything else that he has said about our many communities across this country, if we are to believe that the aim here is to make good law, then surely there should have been a good law-making process to produce this very law, which would have brought the people of this country along for that process. Instead, what we have ended up with is something whereby, as the minister would say, it's the people who are wrong. It's his own officials who are wrong. It's the legal experts who are wrong, the environmental experts, the health experts, former prime ministers, the overwhelming majority of regular New Zealanders who use their time to oppose this legislation, 99% of them, only to be ignored yet again by this government. Then we have the Impartial Law Society, who says, and I quote, as well as being the product of inadequate consultation, the content of the bill itself runs contrary to established precepts of legislative design in various important respects. It is striking that the process and the content of the bill purporting to promote good lawmaking and high-quality legislation should fail to meet not only the bill's own standards, but the existing established processes for supporting good lawmaking. And then we hear about the red tape. The red tape, Mr. Speaker. Well, let's just talk for a minute about the yellow tape, which the minister's own ministry advised him he would be creating with this very piece of legislation. Firstly, the creation of the Regulatory Standards Board, which we've just heard will cost in excess of approximately $3 million of taxpayers' dollars per year. Then there are the new compliance costs with the requirements for each ministry and agency and department to create a consistency accountability statement. And then thirdly, at the conservative estimate of $60 million per year, the requirement to review existing legislation. Again, Mr. Speaker, I'd make the core point that if the government genuinely wanted to engage on the point of how we make good law and improve our constitutional arrangements in this country, we're game. We'd be totally down for that. Because in fact, I think that it'd be great if we could have some form of agreement about the values and the principles that guide this country. But what we instead, unfortunately, have represented here is a pet vanity project from one guy in one political party that has sought to pass this legislation 3 times and failed until it met such a poor negotiator as our current Prime Minister. So on those foundational values, Mr. Speaker, well, I hold the very earnest and perhaps some on the government side might say naive view that New Zealanders actually care about each other and the planet that we live on. But Mr. Speaker, those principles, well, they're nowhere to be seen as far as the design of this legislation. And again, we would make the point that if the government wanted to actually meaningfully engage on how we could go about creating these better processes, the Greens absolutely would have been the first ones sitting around the table. Unfortunately, what we have here is the entrenchment of special rights for those who currently own things. And as we well canvassed in question time today, this government cares not a whisker for addressing inequality. Inequality, Mr. Speaker, which is compounding under intentional government decisions that have been made to push more children into poverty, to make more people homeless, to increase our climate changing emissions and in turn the cost of living for New Zealanders, whilst also making it more difficult for our farmers to farm because guess what? They're the ones hit first and worst by climate change. Mr. Speaker, if we wanted legislation that actually addressed these issues, we could be debating that here in the chamber today, but instead we unfortunately have this petty vanity project. And I'd just make the other point that you kind of can't have it both ways. On one side of things, the government's saying, don't worry, nothing to see here, this is kind of just business as usual, this aligns with stuff that's kind of already happening and in train. But then on the other side, we've got a minister professing that this is a bit of a foundational shift in our constitutional arrangement. And again, I think I tend to believe the latter, because what we've seen from our Prime Minister is an inability to grasp the detail of the things that he has negotiated and put our country on the line for in order to cobble together this coalition government. I just make, in my final 30 seconds, an appeal to the New Zealand First Party. Will the New Zealand First Party please stand up? Because here is an opportunity to truly put New Zealand first. One of our amendment papers, which will be tabled at the Committee of the Whole, will be to stop non-citizens from taking complaints and seeking compensation from the Regulatory Standards Board. And we look forward to New Zealand First supporting New Zealand First. We oppose this bill.
I don't know, Chloe. That's a bit ableist to say, please stand up. They might have members that can't stand up.
Now, here's something Kiwi-Birb has sat and brought up. Now, the thing is with submissions is it's not a referendum. Unfortunately, on this occasion, I'm going to sound like I'm sticking up for David Seymour. But the thing is, submissions is to get public opinion. Submissions, unfortunately, aren't a referendum. Now, at least the good thing here is the arguments that were against the Regulatory Standards Bill actually were grounded in fact. Whereas arguments that are commonly used to say why Māori ward should not exist is based on misinformation. Now, here's something I do sit there and hold the principle. If the submissions are filled with misinformation, should it hold the same weight as something that is based in fact? Now, that's the thing there, because a submission of fact should significantly outweigh a submission of misinformation. But the question will be is, as David Seymour has sat there and said, anything that opposed to it, you suffered from regulatory standards delusion syndrome, or you are completely misinformed or something. Basically, so I don't know. David Seymour might rate that 99% of submissions that were against it were based on misinformation. Completely garbage, but David Seymour would sit there and think that.
Yeah, I mean, just going over these principles again. Like the principles say. I'm just going to open up these principles. The government, good lawmaking. Okay, so the government must talk to people who will be affected by the new law. Did they do that? No, not really. They didn't. They certainly didn't consult with iwi Māori or people, that are in environmentally sensitive areas. So they didn't. They're not really upholding the standards that they're setting forward for future governments. And what was that I just called out before? Sorry, I've got so many notes, but there was one of the principles that they're putting forward. So basically, hold on a minute. Level playing field, high quality, chilling effect on law, environmental stuff. There was okay, yeah, okay, all right. Nope, I don't have it. I said before that they had to be transparent in a way that they could essentially pass a law that could potentially violate human rights or whatever, but as long as they announced it, they had to explain why they're doing it. I can't find the note for that. Where did I put that? Sorry, I'm terrible at podcasting, and I'm very tired, and I drank too much alcohol again. God, I hate it when that happens. Yep, no, I haven't got it.
That's all right. You
there,
can tell me, who's the next argument we should be going to?
You choose.
Oh, okay. So if we go to the rankings in there, let's look at Cameron Brewer's ranked as number one. Was it?
Thanks for watching. Make sure you're subscribed to our Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, Instagram, TikTok.